One of the things that I want you to notice about these constructed response questions is that there is a lot of fluff before they get to the actual question. That's why what I recommend is that you read the question and then you use your pencil to underline where they actually get to the question. This first question about ancient and classical civilizations, they're asking you to provide two legacies of the classical Greek civilization and explain their importance to future civilizations. Again, what I want to emphasize is that you're reading the question carefully and answering all parts of the question. This information is from Unit 2, from that study guide. And so I went into some specifics. This information, we actually did a Greek culture wax museum assignment. And so think back to who you represented for that. So here I talk about Homer and how he wrote the epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then underneath you can see where I put the lasting effect. Epic poems are fundamental to the study of literature today. Next I go into Herodotus, the father of history. He created this word history, set an example of recording history. Next, Pericles, who was on the practice test, a political leader in Athens known for expanding democracy and, of course, the effect that this has. It was a model for future democracies such as our own, and it allowed people to get involved in the government. Next, we see philosophy. So some Greek philosophers were Socrates and Plato, and some of the effects, establishing the field of philosophy, establishing the Socratic method, the idea of going on to higher education from Plato, things like that. Next, Hippocrates. He was known as the father of medicine, believed that illness had a real cause, and so this served as a model for medicine today. So those are some of the possible answers that you could have put. Next, for number 2, how did agricultural improvements transform daily life during the Neolithic Revolution and early history? Give 2 examples. So first of all, to explain what the Neolithic Revolution is, previously in the Paleolithic era, people were hunters, men were the hunters, women were the gatherers. And so they were nomads wandering around looking for sources of food. Now, the Neolithic Revolution was a significant change in history when people started to domesticate animals, meaning they raised livestock for food. They no longer had to hunt for the food, they could raise their food. And then also we see systematic agriculture, which means that they were able to plant crops and harvest them in farming. So what this means, so it talks about so first of all, we talked about what it was, but next, how did this transform daily life? Some of the changes, we see this caused the rise of social classes because people's class was now based on what they did. Next, we see that people could now settle permanently, so this led to the rise of civilizations. They no longer had to wander. And then we see that women actually lost status in society. Previously, it was a 50-50 contribution to the food for the family, and now that women aren't doing gathering, their primary role is to care for the children. So we see that their status actually declined. Now, in number 3, again, fluff. And so here's where we get to the question. Explain how the voyages of exploration affected global interactions and new patterns of trade. And then they give us specific parameters for what they're looking for. 2 examples. One for impact on global interactions and another for patterns of trade. I'm actually going to talk about the economic effects first, so how it affected trade. So we see the rise of capitalism, so people selling goods for profit. Next, we see a world economy where countries are connected through trade. Next, we see countries establishing trading empires. Next, mercantilism, which says that the more gold a country has, the more powerful they are. Next, we see countries using these natural resources and competing for them. Also, we see technology spreading. Next, common trade. Next, what we see is triangular trade and Columbian exchange. So the triangular trade was where goods were sent from Europe to Africa. These are manufactured goods. And then slaves were sent from Africa to the Americas. And then raw materials were sent from the Americas to Europe. Next, another effect on trade is the Columbian exchange. This is where there was an exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World, which was Europe, and the New World, which was the Americas. In terms of effects on global interactions, you could talk about how countries competed to be the strongest country, to have the most resources. You can also talk about some specific effects on the Native Americans, like being forced into labor. We see new populations created. In Africa, global interactions, we see increased warfare, things like that. Next question talks about the changing climate. Give 3 20th century examples of environmental change due to climate. For this question, don't get caught up on 20th century. Just when you see environmental change, pull what you know from science class, from what you've learned in the past. Don't get caught up either on that word climate. Just go for environment. Last year, as Mr. Burr and I were grading these essays, we gave students credit for these type of answers. So deforestation, we see habitat destruction, endangered and extinct animals, increase in greenhouse gases, things like water and food shortages. We see ozone depletion. So those are some examples of things you could have written for this question. Number 5. This was right off of our last test. How did the 1973 OPEC oil crisis affect international affairs? Now, before I go into the effects, let me talk to you about what it was. So Saudi Arabia led an embargo against nations that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Now, an embargo means that they wouldn't sell oil to countries that supported Israel, including the United States. So some effects on international affairs. We can see that it caused rise in oil prices, fuel shortages worldwide. It's going to strain the U.S. economy and other economies. It's also going to force the U.S. to focus on energy conservation. This is when we got things like the speed limits, and it's also going to force the U.S. to focus on developing domestic energy, which means energy sources at home. And again, something else is it's just going to increase tension with Arab countries. Next, this number 6 question. This says, economic and social conditions of colonial rule led to many nationalistic movements. Explain how social and economic conditions in 2 countries led to nationalistic movements. So social means conditions in the society. Economic means things related to the economy, trade, etc. And then in 2 countries that led to nationalistic movements. So what this is saying is, how did it cause countries to have an increase in nationalism, pride, love in their country? And in some of these cases that we'll see in a moment, cause them to rebel against their colonial ruler. So what I've done is I've created this table, and I actually put a key to the nationalism storyboard projects. That's in the NC Final Exam Review folder, so check that out. So what I recommend for this question is that you chose the country that you did for your storyboard project. Hopefully you know that one in depth. And then choose another nationalistic movement that you're comfortable with. So in India, we can see some effects, breakup of industries, rise in unemployment and poverty, the Salt March to protest the salt tax put in place by the British, and then some social effects. We see they didn't like that the British disrespected their culture, things like that. So these things are all going to cause them to rebel against the British. This is going to increase their feelings of Indian nationalism, of their Indian identity. Next, for Pakistan, this was shorter. I couldn't think of anything economic because the reason that they partitioned, remember, broke off from India, was because they wanted to be a primarily Muslim nation while India is primarily Hindu. Next, we see Kenya, and as we've talked about in the past, and this will go for both of these, they didn't like the way that they were treated by their colonial rulers. For example, their resources were taken by their rulers. They didn't get to partake in the profits for that. They didn't get a say in their government. They were looked down upon by their rulers. Think the white superiority that was displayed. And then next, what we see is other social things, denied basic rights. And then as they went and studied abroad in other countries, they learned about how Western freedoms weren't being carried out in their countries. Next, what we see in South Korea is, again, just this conflict over communism versus democracy and the effects that that had. And then we have China, where we see communism, which is when industry comes under the government ownership and land is owned by the community. And then some cultural things. We saw the Cultural Revolution, getting rid of the four olds, things like that. Then Vietnam, we see just again this movement for communism or not. There was this desire to get independence from France, their colonial ruler. So those are just some of the examples. You could also choose to write about the United States and getting independence from Great Britain. So those are the answers to the constructed response. I also posted the key to the constructed response from the fall of 2012. If you want to check those out, you'll see they're similar to these but slightly different. So thank you for taking the time to do this.